Lesson 40, Pivot Tables. Well, the pivot table is Excel's most powerful feature, and I'm happy to say that it works great in VBA. You can generate pivot tables to produce summary reports very quickly. It's very quick to do this in the Excel interface. It's also very quick to do this programmatically to produce your summary reports for distribution. Let's get started. Okay, so I have a data set here: region, product, date, customer, quantity, revenue, cost of goods sold, and profit. Looks like we have 5,000 rows of data. These concepts work equally well with 50,000 or 500,000 rows of data. We can summarize this very quickly using a pivot table. In the Excel interface, we typically go to Insert and then Pivot Table. You see that it first of all defines the range where the data is, A1 through H4989. We choose where the pivot table summary is going to go. Just that way we can see it here. I'm going to put it up in maybe, let's say J5 and click OK. All right, so that process there that we just went through basically creates what's called a pivot table cache. A pivot table cache is where Excel sucks all of that data from the worksheet up into memory and gives us a list of fields, and we can drag these fields to 4 different drop zones in order to create a report. So let's just take a quick look. If we take the product field to column labels, actually let's take it to row labels. So we have products going down the side. The region field we'll take to column labels, so that puts regions across the top. And then in the heart of the pivot table we can choose a numeric value such as revenue. And then the last section, the report filter, we might put customer up there, and we can then use this drop down to create this report for a single customer. All right, that's the basic concept that we have with pivot tables. Well, I'm going to take a look at how we can do this programmatically with Excel. So let's delete this pivot table, and we'll go take a look at the code. All right, so I already have the code here. We're just going to talk about how it works. A couple of things that are new in this lesson is we have an object called the pivot cache. Pivot cache, we can't see it. It exists in memory. It holds all the data from the original data set. I also define an object variable for the pivot table. I use PT for that. And a range variable to define where the range is. So we set up an object variable to the worksheet, and we say for each pivot table in that worksheet's pivot tables, we want to clear it. And that's just in case there's any pivot tables left over from the last time we ran the macro. And I also clear out any data that might be sitting out there in J through Z1. All right, here's where the actual process of setting up the pivot table exists. We figure out what the final row is and the final column, and then define the pivot range as all of that data starting in cell A1. So cell 1, 1 is cell A1. Resize it to be however many rows we have, however many columns we have, and then define the pivot cache. Now this is something we never explicitly do in the Excel interface. I guess when we're going through that first dialog box, when we click OK, it defines the pivot cache. So we add a new pivot cache. The source type is a database, and the source data is the address of my range. Once we have the pivot cache defined, then we're going to use the create pivot table method, and I specify where it's going to go. So it goes to row 2, final column plus 2. So that's actually going out there to column J, and we give it a name. Now the next part is strictly for speed. I say, look, we're going to make this pivot table be manually updated. PT manual update equals true, and I leave that in manual update mode while I add all of the fields and set up the pivot table. You'll see right at the very end is where I go back and change this back to false, and that will actually cause the pivot table to calculate. All right, so what do? I specify row fields, column fields, and page fields. Page fields, they now call report filter, but it's still page fields. So I put the customer up in the report filter, dates going down the left-hand side, and for my column fields, this is not a field in my database. This is a special reserved field called data. That means all of the data fields, the numeric fields that I define, I want those to stretch across the top of the field. And then we go through and set up the individual data fields. Now, it usually takes several lines of code to set up a data field. I'm saying here, I want the revenue field to be a data field. The function that I want to use is I want to sum that field. It should be the first data field. Here's the number format to use, and here's the caption that I want to see. I want to have it be called total revenue. And then I set up the revenue field a second time. This time I want to count position 2, and this will be called the number of orders. And then the revenue field a third time. This time I'm going to average it, and it'll be called average revenue. The fourth field will show me the minimum, the smallest order, and then the maximum, the largest order. The sixth field, this one's a little bit tougher because we are using a calculation, XL percent of total. And here, a calculation XL running total, and we have to base it on the date field. This will create a running total field. One thing that just drives me insane personally is if there was a date without any orders, I want to make sure that we get zeros there instead of blanks. And this line actually draws the pivot table for the first time. We're doing a lot of things in this macro. I just wanted you to have little snippets of code to talk about everything we might ever need to do. This will group the daily dates up by month, quarter, and year, and then again calculate the pivot table using these 2 lines of code. All right, so I'm going to run it down through this point, and we can take a look at the pivot table that we get. So we have our data set here. You'll see there's nothing out in J, K, and L. I run the macro down to that point, and we can go take a look at the macro. Here's all of our daily dates going down the left-hand side. Total revenue, number of orders, average revenue, smallest order, largest order, percent of total, and the year-to-date total, the accumulated total going down through. So a whole bunch of different fields going across. I then group this up using the group method, and these array of false, 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 true, true, true. This is seconds, minutes, hours, days, months, quarters, years. It corresponds to the order in the grouping dialog box. I'll run that line of code and then calculate the pivot table. And you see that we take those daily dates and roll them up to quarterly dates now. Very powerful, powerful feature. As we have the pivot table, don't tell this to anyone at Microsoft, but frankly, for me, most pivot tables, they live for about 30 seconds. I get the pivot table, I select the pivot table, I copy the pivot table, and then I paste values. And then I don't have to worry about all the limitations on the pivot table. So I just want to show off a couple of properties they give us here. One is called table range 2. So if we select table range 2, let's do it again. Table range 2. Let's see if we can see the selection here. I'm going to change the color of table range 2. You see that table range 2 extends all the way from the very first cell in the page area, the report filter area, down to the last cell. It's the entirety of the pivot table. Sometimes, though, you don't care about the page areas and you just want table range 1. Let me select that, and we'll go back here and I'll change table range 1 to be red. And so you can see the difference. Table range 2 includes the page area. Table range 1 includes just the regular section of the report. So depending on what you want to achieve, you can copy one or the other and paste his values to a new worksheet, new workbook, or whatever you need to do. So very, very powerful to create pivot tables. The code is fairly logical. It requires a few extra steps here to set up the cache and then the pivot table, but then you just go through and define your data fields one at a time. Okay, so if you have only one data field, then of course the code gets a lot shorter. Now again, the code for this lesson is on Module 2. On Module 1, I've left all the code from the book VBA and Macros for Microsoft Excel. You can look through examples there of some other things that you might want to do with pivot tables. Examples of just about every method available for using pivot tables. Well, in the next lesson, we're going to take a look at creating charts in VBA. Thanks for watching. I hope you found this lesson helpful.
Looking to advance your career by acquiring new skills? Tired of expensive off-site training programs? Wish you could learn from the best instructors in the industry? Look no further than live lessons. Self-paced, personal video instruction by the world's leading technology publishers. Each live lesson comes with a DVD featuring 3 to 4 hours of instructor-led classroom training, sample program code that allows you to work along with your personal instructor, and an example-rich study guide. Live lessons allow you to watch the entire course from start to finish, or navigate directly to any of the individual lessons. You'll literally watch over the shoulder of your instructor as he shows you how to build state-of-the-art applications. Live lessons, the power of the world's leading technology experts at your fingertips. To learn more, visit mylivelessons.com today.